very happy that we got to make this work. Tobia Spampatti reached out to us a while ago, saying he was here for a conference and has been a frequent visitor of our online environment when we were doing this partly hybrid, but also ever since. And your work has been very insightful for us. And you're today presenting some of the an achievement that I think many of us would applaud you for is a registered report that will come out at Nature Human Behavior, which is well, a journal that many of us value, and that is not so easy at minimum for its criteria, but also for its standards to please the editors and reviewers. You are part of the bigger Center for Affective Sciences, and within that the Consumer Decision and Sustainable Behavior Lab. But the Center for Affective Sciences, I just jokingly said, like, we want to become a Center for Affective Sciences here. Maybe we just stay the Hot Politics Lab, and if I judge the size of the crowd today, that is a good group to be a part of. Floor is yours, 20, max 25 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A. If you're online, welcome. You can ask questions via the Q&A box, and then Gijs will read the questions out loud. Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here, as I said before, in 3 dimensions, because I've been a virtual guest in the past, and I'm really happy to be presenting to you this register report, which is the final work of my PhD dissertation, Psychological Inoculations to Comprehensively Fight Climate Disinformation Around 12 Countries. And before we begin, I should disclose that I have recently developed long COVID. So if you hear me slur my speech, it's not because I've made use of what Amsterdam offers, but yeah, it's a condition. So bear with me. Next time. But yeah, so we are all scientists here. I hope we can all agree that climate change is real, it's humanly caused, and we have to act as fast as possible to, well, mitigate and adapt to most of it. Now, this is the conversation that we have in the scientific conversation or the scientific communications. However, if we look at the public discourse around climate change, you do see these as example of what is also out there. We have a lot of climate disinformation out there, and just recently, last week, somebody who I'm not going to name, has already been named here, has been found guilty of trying to mislead the public again regarding climate change. So much so that different authors in the social sciences have been categorizing almost 60 different types of misinformation that have been spread, and they have kind of categorized as solutions won't work, the science is unreliable, it's not us, it's not happening, and it's not bad. Or in other categorization, to look at what makes, like, the discursive strategies that are being used to delay important climate action. Such as, for example, our carbon footprint is trivial compared to the one of China, so why we should act when other countries are not acting. So much so that the latest IPCC report in their first draft had identified misinformation from vested interest as the main barrier for climate adaptation. Now, this reference to misinformation was removed from future drafts of the IPCC by the same vested interest that are mentioned here. So this is kind of a problem, and it's a societal problem, but as a psychologist, I am interested in why or how does climate disinformation work. And thankfully, this job has been done by others, so I don't have to do it. From Philip Mueller and colleagues, they published this PNAS paper where they looked at why people are anti-science and what we can do about it. And here they identified what they call the core basis of anti-science belief. So they talk about, if you're familiar with communication, they're very easy. They talk about the sender of a scientific anti-scientific message, the message itself, the receiver of a message, and the internal state of the receiver of a message. That to me are kind of, the receiver and their internal state are kind of the same thing. At the same time, another paper came out in Nature Reviews Psychology that looked at the psychological drivers of misinformation beliefs by Ulrich Hecker and colleagues. And here they look at as I said, the psychological drivers of false belief, and they kind of look at two different pathways, the cognitive pathway and the social affective pathway. And within this, they identify different drivers of false belief formation and updating, such as prior beliefs, emotions, moral ideological conviction, things that I think in a hot politics lab you're all familiar with. Just to give you an example, according to this criteria, this is Jim Inhofe, who basically brought us Nobel in the House of Congress, I think this is, and basically said, well, since I have this Nobel here, and this Nobel is not melting, global warming is not real. And we may laugh about it, but the idea is that for somebody who is more an intuitive reasoner, this type of disinformation might appeal to more, and they might be more likely to be influenced by it. So what we thought when we looked at these two papers together is that, well, these two systems seem to be complementing each other pretty well. So what we did is that we put them together and we created what we affectionately call a comprehensive framework of anti-science belief formation and updating, whereby we want to try to identify kind of the entry points where misinformation can enter somebody's psyche, and through that, identify the drivers of anti-science belief formation and updating, and target each one of these 6 drivers with one psychological inoculation each. And we looked at 6 different psychological inoculations, some that are already established in the field, like the scientific consensus inoculation, or we created others like moralizing climate action, or positive emotions regarding climate action, or trust in scientists. And we also adapted the accuracy nudge by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand into an accuracy inoculation. So basically, if you don't know what inoculations are, I think we're all familiar with what vaccines are after the pandemic, or what during the pandemic. And they are basically psychological inoculations work as vaccines that instead of protecting you against a virus, they are psychological vaccines that aim to protect you against an informational or psychological virus. You might have some side effects like changing the color of your hair, but I'm just kidding. But basically what we want to do is to try to protect people from misinformation. And in this sense, for example, with the accuracy inoculation, we think that by giving this inoculation, we can turn people to be more deliberate, or judging statements like the one that I described before as more in a more deliberative thinking mindset, and that would prevent this disinformation from affecting people. So what we did is that we decided to run a register report whereby we took almost 7,000 participants from these 12 countries that you see over here. We introduced them. We introduced the participants to the study, got their consent. We measured their tendency, their baseline tendency for intuitive versus reflective thinking with the cognitive reflection task. We measured political ideology. Then we asked them, how do you feel in general about climate mitigation action? So we wanted to get kind of a baseline measure of their feelings towards climate mitigation action, because we know that feelings kind of are the precursor for policy support or climate action in and of itself. Then we randomize them in 8 conditions, 6 of which are the inoculations that I showed you before. Another one, which is a passive control condition. And for these 7 conditions, we deliver 20 different climate disinformation one after the other that I will show you soon. We also had a prior control condition. And with this prior control condition, we could also look not only at the effect of the inoculations, but also the causal effect of the disinformation on climate beliefs, climate behavior that I'm going to show you very soon, and also true discrimination about true and false statements about climate, about climate change, about climate science. And just to show you a couple of examples of the inoculations. So inoculations are made of 2 different parts. The first one is moderately threatening information, which is basically a sentence that in this case was similar across all inoculations, that basically said that, well, we do have a consensus about anthropogenic climate change, but there are some politically motivated groups that use misleading tactics to try to convince the public. And this was taken from Sander van der Linden's now classical work that brought back psychological inoculations into the field. And then we give the actual inoculation part. So here We had developed before a trust inoculation, and we adapted to trust in scientists, in the IPCC scientists, and in red you see the kind of cues that we try to give, theoretically derived from what we consider are the components of trust. And we basically try to cue as much of them as you can see, like the authoritative scientific body. They have the highest degree of expertise. They are committed to open and transparent review, which we have taken by their website, by the way. We're not inventing. And we were hoping that this shotgun of trust would then protect people from the disinformation. This is the moralization of climate action inoculation. And here we basically try to moralize climate action by cueing morality with using words from the for the Moral Foundation dictionary. I hope you're all familiar with it, but as you can see, basically each inoculation had the first component that was the same, and then we varied as little as possible of the second component just to maintain the text as similar as possible. Now for the disinformation, what we did is that I basically went through different categorization system that categorized who are climate disinformers. I took their Twitter handles that you can see down here at the bottom. I harvested almost 5 million of tweets, and then coded them according to the 60 subcategories of misinformation that I showed you at the very beginning. And then we created what we call a climate disinformation corpus of 78 of these statements that we then validated with a representative sample of British participants across 15 validation measures for individual differences to create basically a set of disinformation statements. And actually, the preprint, we uploaded it yesterday. So in case you want to run studies on climate disinformation, we are making this data set available. But out of these, we only take 20 of the most representative statements of this, because we present 20 consecutive statements. And what we do is that we basically give participants misinforming tweets like this one, and after which we ask, what kind of feelings do you have when you think about actions to mitigate climate change? Then participants answer between very negatively to very positively, and then they receive another one. And we ask them again, how do you feel about this? So that way we can track how their affect updates the more disinformation they receive. So we wanted to look at how it changes the more with multiple disinformation rather than just one. Now for the behavioral task, I don't know if you're familiar with working from the environmental protection task, but it's basically a task whereby participants can choose to identify some numbers that you see here on the bottom, and per each page they choose to complete, we will plant one tree with a NGO who tries to do some reforestation of the Amazon. So basically, they can choose to plant from 0 to 8 trees, and according to how many pages they complete, we plant more trees. But it also has been validated as a measure of actual climate behavior, because what basically participants do is that they spend time to work to create more trees. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, sorry. So they have to click on all these boxes?
No, they have to identify numbers that basically have even first digit and an odd second digit, or the other way around. So like they have to go through and select the correct numbers, and we tell them we are only going to plant one tree if you are 90% accurate in this task. Yeah. And yeah, finally, we also had a true discrimination task, and we followed Racco and Mertens and Sander van der Linden's group, that they have basically created a true discrimination task by using ChatGTP. And what I did is that I put on ChatGTP, can you provide me some true and false information about climate change, but also supporting climate action and delaying climate action? Because what we wanted to do is measure whether people are good at discriminating true or false information, but also whether they would be affected by ideologically congruent versus incongruent information. So we wanted to dissect the two. And I hope you can read there at the back, but for example, a true statement would be that human activities such as burning fossil fuels are the main cause of climate change, and delaying climate action would be that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. for example. So one thing that I forgot to say is that we had a manipulation check for all inoculations. We basically asked them a validated measure of resistance to persuasion, because we thought the inoculation would increase resistance to persuasion about conspiracy theories about climate change, for example. And these are the results for the manipulation check. So we have at the bottom in gray the passive control condition, the one that received the disinformation, and the bearer control condition, and then you have all the different inoculations. And compared to participants in the control condition, all inoculations increased resistance to persuasion. So we know that kind of the inoculations did affect how people were wanted, or at least they reported being more motivated to resist conspiracies against climate change. When it comes to this task of 20 different measures of affect, these are each of the condition. In gray, you see this the control condition that only received the disinformation, and in colors, you see the other conditions. Unfortunately, the main effect of condition in the multi-level model that we used was not significant. So we couldn't really say that there were significant differences across the conditions. Also, because at the end of these 20 different measures, we use equivalence testing to show that, well, there was no significant improvement of the inoculations, but the inoculations were their effect was significantly smaller than a Cohen's d of 0.20 across all the inoculations, which was sad. And it kind of makes sense if I show you the results of all the other DVs that we had. So we have the beliefs in the reality, anthropogenic nature, and consequences of climate change, the truth discernment score in this task that I showed you before, and the behavior in the tree planting task, so how many trees they planted. Now, one cool thing is that we planted almost 11,000 trees with this project, which is always nice for the environment.
At least something bad.
Yeah, at least. Well, another impact that we see is that the disinformation does affect how people's belief in the reality of climate change, in the anthropogenic nature, not in the consequences, but in their truth discernment score, and it affects their behavior. But we do not find a protective effect of any of the inoculations besides the accuracy inoculation for the truth discernment score. And I should mention that these are all equivalence tests that are significant, and null hypothesis testing that is not significant. So like we can say that if there is an effect is much smaller than what we had expected, but there is one effect of the accuracy inoculation, whereby we say to participants, think about the accuracy of the information that you're going to receive before before being affected by the information, and it actually seems to make people better at discerning false information that try to delay climate change. So this information, such as the one that I showed you before, the carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Now, we also pre-registered that we were going to look at the moderation by this tendency for intuitive affective thinking, because we thought, okay, well, the inoculations that are more effective, such as the moralization inoculation, the positive emotion inoculation, and the trust, would work better for people who are more intuitive, or that try to reason more in an intuitive way, and the other way around for the accuracy, transparent communication, scientific consensus that would work for people who are more oriented towards deliberative thinking. And tentatively, this is actually what we find. Sorry for the pixelated numbers, but in blue you see people who are more deliberate, and in red you see people who are more intuitive. And what we basically see is that, well, it seems to be the case that the cognitive inoculations work better for people who are more deliberate, and the other way around for the social affective. So these type of inoculations might benefit from targeting people according to their reasoning style and matching the reasoning style with some of the inoculations. Now, we also looked at, we're here talking about politics as well. So we looked at political ideology across the 12 countries. However, there we couldn't really find an effect. I can show you just, for example, for the trust inoculation. But here, basically, people who were at the extreme. There was basically a main effect of political extremism, but there was no moderating effect of the effects of the inoculation according to political ideology. Like the slopes looked kind of similar across all inoculations, which was very interesting to see it. One thing that I can quickly share before I run out of time is that we looked at the moderation of political ideology on this truth dissemination task, because we wanted to see, as I said before, whether people are better or worse at recognizing true and false information, but also true information that are congruent versus incongruent to their own ideology and the other way around. And from a motivated reasoning perspective, you would expect, for example, that the more people are conservative, so the more they get to the 10 of the scale, the more they are going to believe in information that delay climate action, regardless of whether it's true or false, and the other way around for information that want to support climate action. However, what we see is this for the control condition only, so the ones who didn't receive any information, we see that it seems that conservatives are more likely to report that disinformation, such as carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, is real, but the effect is only on this type of information. So they still are as likely as liberals to say, well, statements that support climate actions are true, but at the same time, they are more likely to support also the fact that those, like the opposite of what those statement means. So it seems that there is not motivated reasoning, but there is a bit of not reasoning in this in this specific study. And the reasoning happens only when they receive the disinformation. Then when they receive the disinformation, they are more likely to believe the disinformation, but also less likely to believe the statements that say, well, climate change is real, is humanly caused, and we should act about it. So if anything, this is further proof that we kind of have to find a way to prevent the noxious effects of disinformation, because it affects selectively believing true information and the information that we always use to talk about climate change. So I will conclude that, well, climate disinformation affects people's, well, almost everything that we have measured in this study. And in comparison, no inoculation had an effect that was larger than the one that we pre-registered on any of the dependent variables, but we have a promising effect of the accuracy inoculation on truth discernment. We'd also see this treatment heterogeneity of this moderator of cognitive reflection. And in general, what I conclude for this is that, well, after 50 years of climate disinformation is still a problem, and we should try to aim to develop better interventions to fight it, because what we have proposed here didn't seem to work. So I thank you for listening. Sorry for going a tiny bit over time. And yeah, thank you. And as this might have been very depressive, sorry, this is just to make everybody happy again. Thank you.
And we need to do a very quick Q&A because Tobia has to get back to this. Is it a lady dog or a man dog?
Lady dog.
Lady dog.
I have all the time needed.
All right, we have 35 minutes for Q&A. I see a very anxious finger already here, so please raise your hand. I will start here with you.
Okay, it's just a clarification question.
Sure.
Could you go back to the discernment page where you have those statements that are true or false? I just noticed something that some of the statements are like more on the factual side, like saying climate activities cause climate change, or some of them are having a bit of normative language, like should not be subsidized or something like that. I was wondering, how when you're making this statement, have you think about that? Because I feel like if you have a normative part, like should it be something like that, and people might have different, like they might not think of whether it's true or false when they're typing this statement, when more on the subjective side, like how do I do this?
That's a really good question. No, we didn't. We didn't try to kind of, how to say, we didn't try to control for a lot of things in this. What we do is that we statistically try to take into account in the multi-level models by making a random intercept per each one of the statements. So we try to remove that variance as much as possible. But yeah, this is one of the parts that the kind of reviewers asked us to add, and I wish we could have done a little bit more testing beforehand, but we couldn't. At the same time, it is, I would just slightly disagree with the should, because the should as a moral statement, because kind of it can be also a factual statement in the sense of climate mitigation actions. Like, for example, if I would say, like, we should not create new fossil fuel projects, it's a statement based on the fact that if we create new projects, we're gonna depass kind of the benchmarks that we have or keeping a stable climate. And in that case, it's kind of a scientific boundary, but not, and a moral boundary, but it's a scientific boundary first. So I would be, like, depending on which statements we're considering, I would be careful to frame it as moral versus factual, if that makes sense.
Josh.
Okay. So early on in the talk, you made a statement that I thought was incredible, and that is that you said that one of the primary drivers of climate change happened to be public opinion being driven in a particular direction. Or do I misunderstand you?
I would not frame it that way.
Okay.
I mean, I think one of the primary drivers that in the IPCC report they mention is misinformation.
Okay. So, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm thinking here is that perhaps there's some kind of issue with framing it that kind of way, because there's this underlying assumption that if it's misinformation that's one of the drivers of it, then there must be some kind of important connection between public opinion and the decisions that office holders make. But as we look out into the world, particularly in places like the US, that's not in fact true. So if you look at the work of people like Gillies and people like him, you see that, as a matter of fact, the political elites are not responsive to the public at all. And so, at least for some place like the US, I somewhat wonder if there's a mismatch between the problem and this proposed solution. Although, maybe for other places where you do have democratic regimes that happen to be more responsive, I know this is pathetic, don't get me wrong.
No. I would love to stay here for the full weekend to discuss this, because I think it's a long discussion. So for me, misinformation is a problem of public opinion, but it's also a problem of elite opinion in two ways. One, that misinformation could be used to convince elites that they shouldn't act about climate change. So even if the public is well informed, and we have quite some evidence that now people do have a strong perception of the scientific consensus, it might be that misinformation targeted at elites could be one of the main causes of inaction. At the same time, I also think that, well, personally, this is my personal opinion, is that, well, lobbying might have a bigger effect of misinformation, but in that sense, misinformation is used for justifying inaction. So it still have an indirect effect, which has the same effect of not having action. So in that sense, you could consider misinformation as one of the drivers. I wouldn't say that is the primary driver. I mean, I personally was not part of the IPCC draft, but I do balk a bit at the idea that that's the main problem.
Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. Great topic to slide today. So I want to first ask again, what we find is that people are better and active to acknowledging disinformation, but do not find an effect on behavior, unless it's clean thing, right?
We do find an effect on behavior.
On the tree, on like how many?
Yeah, they plant less trees, half of a tree less, let's say,
Okay.
give or take.
What I'm interested in a bit about this in combination with climate change. How much do you think of this as actually just that people learn how to distinguish misinformation in general, but when it really comes to climate action, there's more to this than just learning, you know, I can learn that something is false or that something is inaccurate, but I can still not care about the climate.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I'm wondering, do you think people would also found this if you would tell them like, I don't know, you do an activity task for something else. What is really about planting a tree and what is just about the method?
so that's a wonderful question. There are different opinions about it because I have had this discussion with some other people that work on misinformation, and for them, behavior is not a thing. The important thing is to make people 100% accurate. And for me, when it comes to climate change, I would be like, well, even if people are 90% accurate, but they act more to protect the climate, I still would count it as a better win than them being 100% accurate, but not acting about climate change. So yeah, it depends on who does the research. I honestly have seen very little about the effects of misinformation on behavior, and I don't know of any study about climate action and the effects of misinformation on climate action. So we just wanted to see, like, does it affect this validated task first, and then maybe we can make it into other types of actions as well. So, but we have to start with something that we can deliver to participants who are participating in an online study. So yeah, and the reason why we chose this task is because right now there has been a many labs collaboration where they use this task across 60 different countries. So I was just curious to compare it with that effort, basically.
Because I think it's really a great trend. It just reminded me of this, I think it's from Catholic Chinese scrolls, where you have a social dilemma and you have to also get money for themselves and service to invest the money in reforestation. So this is why I was interested if there were like a condition where people also had to be accurate, but for themselves, right? So that's what I think would be a nice message.
Yeah, there are other studies that have other validated tasks that look at something like that more than this one. This one, the self-payment is that they would finish the studies sooner. So like it's just a time concern, and in the end, it's kind of also for. I mean, we paired not with M-Turkers, but it's also like a money by time concern that they were paid for an X amount of study, and there were people who stayed doing this task for 40 minutes instead of the 20 that we allocated to this task. So yeah, there is a cost, but there is a different type of cost than just monetary. Yeah.
Honorata and then Marcus.
Okay, so maybe my question will be a bit provocative. So I will try to phrase it well. But what is your opinion about the metaphor of inoculation here? Because you presented it at the beginning as something that, oh yeah, you all know what inoculation is. But when I think about it, inoculation is for a very specific disease, and I don't think misinformation is a very specific disease. And if we look at some studies that come out nowadays that use inoculation strategies, they say, or at least, you know, we can, if we trust the results, they say that what you're doing to people is you're making them generally skeptical towards information that comes in. So what's your view on that? And then maybe, I don't know, to give hope to the inoculation metaphor, just to get out of the provocation, there is also this study that I'm sure you know in the PNAS that shows that basically time and any kind of subversive information about climate change delete the effects of positive information that you get, or let's say accurate information that you get. Maybe it's about the second dose or first dose of the vaccine, if we go with this metaphor.
So can we stop the recording? So for the provocation, I don't think it's a provocation because I actually agree with you. So when it comes to the vaccine, we refer to these inoculations as broad spectrum vaccine. That's how they're referring to the literature, that like you're not looking at a specific disinformation, because here it would be impossible with 20 different ones. And we just say like, we try to give as broad of a protection as possible against disinformation. I do think I had a discussion with Sander on Twitter actually on the backfiring effects or backfiring or the complex effects of their inoculation, and their inoculations, in my opinion, what they say is that they're meant for people to learn about manipulation techniques and not being affected by them. And the comment that I have about it is that, well, we do have some true information that use emotions or that are actually conspiracies or they are polarizing. So if you tell people not to be manipulated by those, they're not going to be affected by the true information as well. So that to me explains a bit of that, making people more skeptical in general, because talking about misinformation is different than talking about manipulation in general. I don't completely agree with the fact that all emotions are manipulation. But I mean, being from the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences, obviously, I might be having some cognitive dissonance there. But in our study, we did the same analysis as Ariana Modirusta-Gallian, I'm sure I'm butchering her name, did on Sander's work, because we were also like wondering, well, if we make people moralize climate action and believing that the climate action is morally good, maybe they're going to be less good at identify true and false information. We don't see that. So we actually try to be as open as possible about the shortcomings of this. And in this particular study, we don't see effects, but we don't see any noxious effects either. So in that sense, we're pretty happy that it didn't budge them, at least in a backfiring direction. But yeah, it is difficult to develop interventions that work as intended, as I think you're all aware. Or better vaccines and tested rigorously throughout different TVs. I think that would be the solution to me.
Okay, I forgot to mention it. If you're online and you want to ask a question, you can type it into the chat. Marcus.
Yeah, I also have the same question about the metaphor. I mean, luckily the COVID vaccines didn't depend on our reasoning styles for their effectiveness. So it's quite different in terms of this kind of population is quite different from a real one, right? I also wonder about given the overlap between anti-vax and climate change skeptics, and using the metaphor inoculation as something to appeal to climate change skeptics seems difficult. But my other question was on the global reach of your study, and what motivated you to do it so globally, and whether you found any differences between different countries. Things like left and right work very differently, but also the state of the climate change debate. I can imagine it's quite different in Ghana or Nigeria or Australia. Australia's in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can imagine that could create some differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So one cool thing is that there are studies by the Yale Climate Communication Center for Climate Communication, whereby they looked at people's perception of climate change, and it seems to be a strong majority of the population across most of the countries that we surveyed that they do believe in climate change. So in that sense, I think the variation is less than we would expect. We looked at these countries for specific reasons. One, we were asked to look at more countries than just the US. So this is what we did. And at the same time, we tried to pick countries where English was an official language, so we didn't have to translate the material in other languages, because also the tweets were taken from English Twitter as well. So we tried to maintain as broad of a reach without incurring in penalties for that. When it comes to looking at differences across countries, if you do the math, it's basically we only had around 70 participants per country per condition. So we cannot really look at differences. I would have loved to, but we would have needed like 7,000 participants per country. And that for just one study of my PhD was a bit too much. So yeah, I wish there was, I wish there would have been the resources to do that, but this is what we had to work with.
So in Switzerland, resources are finite.
Academic research.
Yeah, just to build on this, because I had the exact same question, but I was still wondering, do you know more about, of course, you have the numbers are just too small to say anything meaningfully when it comes to statistical significance, but can you say anything about effect sizes? Do you know if they strongly differ between countries? So just, yeah, the size.
I haven't looked at it because the confidence intervals will be so wide that I didn't feel comfortable even putting that information in the paper, because I think it would be misleading on my side, because we didn't have enough.
It would be interesting. I mean, maybe to not only to look at the separate countries, but then maybe to group some countries from specific regions or which share specific characteristics, and to see if there are differences between them, right? Because there might be something in terms of differences in context that can,
maybe that was one of the shortcomings of doing a register report, because to justify an analysis, I had to give specifically theoretical reasons to do so. And I didn't feel like the misinformation literature was good enough in cross-country comparisons to really make a prediction about it. So we actually was asked by the reviewers to add hypotheses about political ideology, and I was like, well, we don't even know about the interaction between inoculations and political ideology, so I cannot make predictions, so we are just going to look at it in an exploratory way. So yeah, that was one of the reasons why we didn't look at those specifically. But yeah, I mean, the data is going to be available, so if anybody wants to have a look that is more expert in comparative politics than me, you're more than welcome to.
One question would be, I might have missed that, how you introduced them to the misinformation manipulation, because people, I think, as well as in their natural environment, as well as study participants, are not used to being confronted with a set of information that is entirely false. So my thought was that they're bound to believe some of it because they don't expect to be just confronted with misinformation. And so then believing that part of the information you present them with is true might affect their behavior afterwards. That's why I was wondering how you introduce this part of the...
So we just tell them that they're going to receive some information about climate change that they might find online. So it was very neutral. We did have a question about demand effect. So we did ask at the end whether or not participants were aware of the study. The way that we coded it, that we were asked to code it, was to look at demand effects for the inoculations more than the misinformation, and what we see is just like 0.1% of the participants actually realized what the study was about. So we hope there was, I mean, it's very difficult to know whether actually there was some demand effects, but by that question, it didn't seem to me that participants were really zeroing in on what we wanted them, or didn't understand what we wanted them to do. And at the same time, well, the reason why I went back to this slide is because there is kind of a plateauing, if you look at the curve that happened after like 5-ish information. And if you were people who were thinking of, okay, this person is trying to convince me by each information, I would expect the curve to continue going down. Instead, this is not what I see, and by that, I'm thinking, well, they might be engaging with the task. So that would be my defense. I would hope, like the original plan was to run an fMRI study after this to like look at it without having to ask participants about their belief with a scale. But seeing that there was no effect, we decided not to pursue that avenue. But that would have been an answer that would go beyond just this kind of repetitive task that was not very ecologically, that could have been more ecologically valid. That's all.
There's a question online from Anna. The question is, were all 5 moral foundation domains included in one moralization condition, or were there different moralization conditions per domain? And then there's if yes, but first let's establish whether it's yes or no.
Oh, that's a really good question. I used the Moral Foundation Dictionary from a paper from Geneva and colleagues, and there I think the list was only of words that were cueing morality rather than explaining which moral foundation they were cueing. So it could be possible that we didn't include some moral foundations. So I will have to double check on that.
Yeah, because Anna writes that it may be interesting to use these different moralization conditions crossed with this distinction between intuitive and deliberative cognitive styles.
Yeah, I could look at that. Yeah, I mean, the moralization inoculation worked better overall for participants who were more inclined to reason intuitively. But yeah, it would be really cool to look at that. Maybe in the future.
Ask something about the effect sizes, because I really like what you did here is to think about them in advance and to also say, well, you know, the effects we find are a lot smaller too. But what was the reasoning to put the effect size at this particular level? And I'm not saying this like I have no ideological stake or sort of career incentives in manipulation, but it's just the reasoning, like why this?
That's a wonderful question. So the 95% power is because register reports are required.
No, I know. Yeah.
The effect size was because this was the meta-analytically identified effect size of fact-checking. So what we decided, or what we said, is that, well, we're going to introduce a new type of intervention in the field. We are going to just introduce it if it's better than what is already available. Yeah. So it was like practically relevant, let's say. And in that regard, I should mention that is the effect size of fact-checking against one disinformation, not 20. So that was one of the problems, is that, well, not many people ask or look at the effects of multiple disinformation, because we actually looked exploratorily the effects of the inoculations after the first disinformation, which is kind of closer what happens, and there the protection was complete. So like there was no decrease from the pre-test to after the first disinformation for participants who were inoculated. This is an exploratory analysis again. There was no decrease, but there was a significant decrease in the passive control condition. So what seems to be the case is that, well, the inoculation might protect against one information, but it doesn't protect better than fact-checking after that first disinformation. So if the idea is to have the inoculations as substitutes that will protect people from lung, it seems that you have to give a booster shot after each disinformation. And at that point, it's better to have fact-checking or to have other types of interventions. So I hope that answers the question.
That makes sense.
Oh.
Depends on how many booster shots you need after family weekend.
No, but I think especially this also shows the value of being explicit about this at the start.
Yeah. No, I mean, we try to figure out which effect size would make sense, and that was what we come up with. And also, because in terms of feasibility, we had quite a lot of participants, so we felt comfortable that this was a good objective between practical relevance and feasibility across the countries.
About this, I do wonder how much we should use existing studies to determine our cones, because most studies have this, either this N or something smaller. But I mean, for me, indeed, the average effect size that I've found is 0.2. And that's as much a function as the things we're interested in as the number of participants my budget typically allows. Right? Because we also, with this reasoning, we also risk just putting a lot more money into one particular context and trying to find a much smaller effect. That could potentially still be meaningful, but
I agree.
The last part is always hard to distinguish.
I agree, and to me, when it comes to justifying a smallest effect size of interest, when it comes to misinformation, I'm like, well, a coin D of 0.001 might be of interest at the level of the population. So it's difficult to say like that there is a lower bound by which I want to run a study. So yeah, I think this gets us closer to our goal of identifying the real effect sizes of these inoculations, because we can see from here, but also like Sander's work with 11,000 participants, they find an effect size of a hedges G of 0.08 or something like that. So yeah, I mean, that might be the ballpark of what we should be aiming for.
And I'm thinking particularly about this this Facebook study. What's the name of the guy again?
Robert Bond.
Yeah, it's like they find an effect size of 0.000 something, and then people ended up discussing whether they had actually changed the election outcome.
Yeah, I think in general we could be better at estimating effect sizes of interest and interpreting effect sizes.
But in your defense, because you do say, well, we know from fact checking that this is more or less the effect. So because there's obviously a little bit of an inoculation industry, or at least a few people have definitely have a good career on this. And what I like about it is you say, well, but this other thing we have has an average effect size of 0.2. So for the inoculation compared to that to matter, we want it to be dissimilar. That I like that defense a lot, actually.
Yeah, and I mean we did it because not to throw some shade to other researchers that work on the field, but because we introduced new inoculations. So we were like, if we have to like dilute our efforts, it's better to do so if we have some valuable information that these new interventions actually work. But it also seems that the older intervention doesn't really seem to be protecting as well. So maybe we should go back to the drawing board and make better interventions.
We have time for a few more questions. Yeah.
Thanks. It was really interesting. Can you go to the inoculations? So, just what you mean by misinformation is whatever goes against the consensus of the scientific community, right? I'm wondering, like, do you think it might not work if somebody did a study of what the self-proclaimed political views are of these scientists, and then they say, oh, and by the way, they're all self-proclaimed leftists or liberal, and then the conservative will be like, aha, of course there's consensus among those people, and then not trust it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in this particular circumstance of the trust inoculation, we had some previous studies where we used a similar text, but about trusting the government to handle the energy transition. And there we looked at pre-existing level of trust in the government to see if that's would backfire for people who really don't trust the government. And what we actually see is that there is no significant moderation by it. So even like independently of where they would go in a visual analog scale, participants would still be affected in the same way by the trust inoculation. So yeah, in that sense, I am not super afraid of these pre-existing attitudes with this particular inoculation. What I would be very interested to see is somebody testing an inoculation that says you're gonna be inoculated by left-wing people, and see if that protects against my inoculation and then affects misinformation. But then, yeah, because in the end, it's just a rhetorical device, inoculations that can be used by anyone.
Because it just I studied the Vietnamese political thought, like the communists, because they're like, you're going to hear lies from the capitalists, you know. But this is obviously different because there's like global consensus here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a rhetorical device that is used by a lot of people. I mean, Ramaswamy in the previous GOP debates, don't listen to everybody who has been bought out, but me, that I have not. So that you could like define it as a kind of an inoculation in and of itself. So yeah. I mean, if anybody wants to run this study of inoculating against an inoculation, feel free to add me as a reviewer. I would be very interested.
One more question.
But you see,
Yeah, you go ahead.
So I would like to just said before, what's your view then on how we should solve this crisis fastest? Because in the end, what all these studies are showing us, that these effects are either not there, go in the opposite direction, or very minuscule. And I think we've had it with, for example, issues like smoking before. And we know that nothing changed with smoking, and no amount of information and persuasion worked with smoking until policy was established. And you just couldn't smoke indoors, for example. Or the prices, the taxes went superbly high. And these are all actions by the government, right?
Yeah.
What's your stand on that?
I'm just a PhD student.
You are a very, very well versed PhD student
Thank
in
you.
the debate,
So
your opinion matters.
yeah, jokes aside, we do give some other more systemic level interventions or possibilities in the paper. I personally think that each solution for each misinformation infodemic is different. When it comes to climate change, we kind of have some historical evidence of who has been spreading climate disinformation for decades now. And I would think that interventions that make people more deliberate in selecting their sources when it comes to climate disinformation might be better than debunking each one of the arguments. So like redirecting them to good sources and kind of lowering nauseous sources might be a better type of intervention. So something that I would love to. I have a couple of projects in my head that I hope one day will get funding on that. But yeah, I think sources is a much more promising strategy to me than protection against specific type of disinformation. Because the disinformation change every time, but the people who are spreading them are always the same, and yeah, still getting very high salaries because of it. So that would be my personal opinion. Yeah.
And good luck with finding funding.
We all need it.
Some people say that inoculation works, but actually,
some politically motivated.
Yes.
okay, with that said, thank you, Tobia. Give him a warm round. As a presenter in the Hot Politics Lab, is this a clean one, guys, or used? You get a mug. Bring it to Geneva.
Absolutely.
Spread the word.
Well, you're going to become our competitor, so I'm not.
That's on video now, right? So the coming weeks, we have also a set of exciting speakers. Next week, Macarena Ares from the University of Barcelona will be here. The week after, Lisanne ten Brinker from Erasmus University, followed by, on October 20, Amanda Friesen, who has visited our lab before, from Western Ontario University, who will give a talk. On November 3rd, we have a full day Dutch Hot Politics Lab with, among other speakers, Gijs, I think, and Isabella Rebasso. And on November 10th, we have Finn Arsenault. And then on the 17th, already checking out the room today, Marcus Wagner. So exciting guests from different places doing exciting work. So look forward.
Also, we have 2 upcoming PhD defenses.
Right.
So Wednesday, 18 October at 4 o'clock, Tobia Spampatti will defend his dissertation on media-based gendered mechanisms, something like this.
You should learn the title.
Yes.
It's on video.
It's on how media misrepresent female politicians. That's from 4 to 5:30 in the Agnietenkapel, and then on 10 November at 11, from 11 to 12:30, Isabella Rebasso will defend her dissertation titled "Feeling Within Reason." Well, it's the other way around, reason within feeling.
You have some homework to do. November 10, you're going to be with us all day. First Isabella's defense, then Finn's talk, and then a party. So I think that will be a fun day. Then last but not least, our sponsors. Remember, you can become a sponsor of the Hot Politics Lab always. But we thank the NWO, the European Commission, the universities, our departments. And obviously, we can only do this with a fun group of people, and that are, you're not our sponsors, but you are our members, and it's fun to have these nice full meetings with you in this Friday afternoon session. So see each other next week again.